Russian ballet diaspora in 1939, and she choreographed a number of ballets in New York for various companies, but then she subsequently decided to settle in California, in Southern California, Los Angeles, probably because there was less competition from other Russian teachers. Many Russian teachers had settled in New York by that time. And she had a remarkable group of students during the 1940s in California. The woman on the left there is Sid Charisse, a very young Sid Charisse. If any of you know Hollywood musicals, she did a lot of musicals in the 1940s and 50s. And over here, the two women are actually sisters. One of them is Marjorie Tallchief, who became the first American étoile at the Paris Opera. And the other is Maria Tallchief, who eventually married Balanchine and became the first star of the New York City Ballet.
У 1939 році Ніжинська емігрувала остаточно до Сполучених Штатів. Я робила багато колег по цеху з колишньої російської балетної, так би мовити, середовища. І вона вирішила жити в Каліфорнії, в Лос-Анджелесі, мабуть, тому що там було менше конкуренції з боку інших хореографів та викладачів танцю з колишньої Росії. Її багато було в Нью-Йорку. І в 40-ті роки вона мала досить плідний період викладання, і ось фотографії деяких з її учнів, учениць. Ліворуч ми бачимо Сід Шаріс, яка була, можна сказати, зіркою в мюзиклах в 40-50-ті роки в Голлівуді. А праворуч ми бачимо двох сестер. Це Марджорі Тортчієв і Марлін Тортчієв. Марджорі стала прямою балериною в Паризькій опері, першою, власне, такого штибу. А її сестра Марія одружилася з Баланчиним і була зіркою Нью-Йоркської опери.
Нью-Йорк Сіті Балет.
Нью-Йорк Сіті Балет. I should mention that they're over there, they're rehearsing the ballet which she called Etude, or sometimes Bach Etude. Sometimes it had other titles, but she had begun to rehearse that very, very early, actually, when she was still here in Kiev. And then she began setting it at various points during the 1920s. And as you see, it has this almost, this religious iconography there. And this is also Etude when it was actually on stage at the Hollywood Bowl.
Ми бачили фотографії з репетиції етюду, чи як вона назвала Бах етюд, який вона почала розробляти ще з початку 20-х років і ставила кілька разів по-різному. І ось ми бачимо тут, власне, на сцені Hollywood Bowl.
Etude was a very important work in her Western career, because it was a fully plotless work. It was a very early ballet to the music of Bach, and it aroused, and it was also, the costuming was unisex. In the first version, the designs were by, the first version that was produced, the designs were by Alexandra Ekstedt, whom she had met in Moscow and worked with and knew here in Kiev, where she had a studio for many years. These costumes were by Boris Belinsky, who is a Russian emigre artist as well as a film designer in Paris. So this was a very important work, and one that's really not very little, and it's hardly anyone knows about it. They talk about Doris Humphrey doing the Bach ballet. They talk about Balanchine's Concerto Barocco to Bach, but they very seldom mention this and very seldom realize how it was a very, very early example of an abstract ballet.
Етюд був важливою роботою для Ніжинської, і це був цілком безсюжетний твір на музику Баха. Один із ранніх прикладів абстрактного балету. Треба сказати, що костюми тут не мають ознак статі, це такі костюми унісекс. І першу версію костюмів і сценографії робила Олександра Екстер, художниця, з якою Ніжинська познайомилася в Москві, і потім дружила в Києві, де декілька років Олександра Екстер мала свою відому студію, майстерню. Але ця версія костюмів була зроблена художником Борисом Белінським, також одним із представників російської творчої діаспори. Він працював в Парижі, був художником і художником фільм-дизайнером, художником кіно.
Yes.
I suggest maybe we take a break for questions soon, just as
Okay.
a matter of time.
Okay. Then let's just very quickly go through the last couple of ones. This is from a ballet she did in New York City that in many respects harks back to Les Noces. It was designed by Boris Aronson, who is a member of the Kulturlied here and then eventually settled in New York. And the last one, you want to do that one?
Нью-Йоркський City Ballet, постановка Les Noces,
Oh, sorry. Oh, wait, sorry, I got this messed up. No, it was, it's called Pictures at an Exhibition.
Ага, картинки з виставки. Художник тут Борис Аронсон, який також працював тут в Києві, коли існувала Культурліга.
Okay, and the very last slide is from 1960, where she's rehearsing two dancers in a production of The Sleeping Beauty for the Marquis de Cuevas company. And I love this photograph. I love to see her. Here she is, looking a little bit dumpy, not an elegant person, but there are these beautiful expressive arms and hands.
І наостанок фотографія 60-го року. Це репетиція для спячої красуні в театрі Маркії де Cuevas. І мені подобається ця фотографія тим, яка вона тут. Ми бачимо, що вона вже не така граціозна і гідна танцівниця, вона вже трохи така незграбна, але руки в неї дуже артистичні і експресивні.
Okay, so maybe we should have some questions. That's the end of my slideshow and an overview of Ніжинськa's life. So if there are any questions or comments, please.
Я показала вам всі слайди.
Можете, пожалуйста, чуть подробнее рассказать о периоде ее работы в Киеве и о том, как она развивала свою точку.
I think one of the first things is that she was trying to figure out a way to teach dancers how to move so that they could adapt themselves to modern choreography. She had seen with her brother in The Rite of Spring and in Afternoon of a Faun that the dancers did not want to do that movement. And that the kind of class that they had in the morning and the kind of work they were doing, the way they had been trained, made it very difficult for them to adapt. So she was seeking to create dancers who could adapt to newer forms of choreography. So that's where I think the teaching and the choreography go hand in hand. I think she was almost certainly impressed by what Cuevas was doing. There were many dancers in her school or in her studio who who were also part of the Kurvas group, so there was a certain amount of circulation. And she became aware that she herself wanted to create dances that did not look like some of the solos that she had done before, which were fairly traditional. And that she had to develop a way of moving, a way of teaching movement that would enable that to happen. It is people have asked whether she was influenced by Dalcroze, by Delsarte, by Laban. She always protested that she had nothing to do with Dalcroze. She hated Dalcroze, mainly because her brother had something to do with it. But it's also difficult to know what was happening in 1916, 1917, and 1918 as some Dalcroze ideas and Delsartean ideas are being transformed by especially theater artists and some dance artists, but especially theater artists, and are being theorized in a very different way. I believe she picked these things up. I'm not so sure that she read all of those, she read the material. I also think she was influenced by what was happening in the visual arts, that when she saw what Exter was doing in 1917, 1918, that this just, transformed her. And that there are some very early theoretical writings in which she talks about, it's clear that her model, the model in her mind, is the visual arts, and that they're no longer representational, but they're more abstract. And that, I think, is what begins her thinking. And it's also interesting to me that so much of that rethinking seems to begin, after her experience with her brother, it seems to develop theoretically, and then it seems to take on a practical aspect. I'm sorry, I talked too much.
Отже, про методику її викладання, її підходу до трансформації, концепції руху такого, який відбувався в Києві, в її школі руху. Треба сказати, що вона хотіла створити такий тип танцівника, якому легко було б пристосуватися до нової стилістики, до нового модерністського мистецтва. І вона побачила на постановках «Весни священної» і «Полудень Павна» українською, що танцівникам класичної школи важко сприймати ці рухи. Вони неохоче до того бралися і не мали інструментарію, не мали підходу до цього гнучкового. І вона вирішила розробити школу, яка б розвила певні якості, творчі якості, здібності в танцівниках, щоб вони могли сприймати і творчо переосмислювати рух як такий, і які б дуже відрізнялися від тих соло, які вона сама танцювала, коли танцювала в балетах. І треба сказати, що вона багато працювала не лише з танцівниками, танцівницями, а також і з акторами. І в тому вони перетиналися з Курбасом, тому що деякі актори театру Курбаса в неї вчилися, і це було спільне коло, творче таке театральне, танцювальне коло. І ще для неї багато важило visual arts, живопис, пластичні мистецтва. Вона тим надихалася, під впливом Екстер була довгий час, і також модерного мистецтва. Ми бачимо, що коли вона мислить, коли вона пише теоретичні свої праці, для неї точкою відліку є visual arts, є, власне, живопис, скоріше за все. І часто питають її зв'язок з теоретичними працями Далькроуз. Так, і вона...
Франсуа Дельсарт, Рудольф Лавр.
Дельсарт, так, дякую. І вона пише, що зараз не вона пише, а невідомо, чи вона читала їхні твори, але вона казала, що вона, коли її питали, вона відповідала, що вона не любить цю методику, вона не має з тим нічого спільного, може тому, що її брат з тим мав справу досить тісно. І треба сказати, що загалом її шлях був відхід від сюжетності, від фігуративності. І спершу вона своє бачення втілила в теоретичних напрацюваннях, а потім втілювала на практиці.
Все-таки, якщо ви задали про Дель Сарта, Дель Проза, Рудольф фон Лавен, а от німецький Ausdrucktanz.
Once again, it's very difficult to establish any kind of direct connection. There appear to be certain physical resemblances in her treatment of space, in her treatment of ideas, certain ideas about the ensemble, the sculptural aspects of the body, but I cannot actually establish any kind of, connection. She did not read German. She had very little, or maybe a few words, but that was all. And her world was very much this Russian emigre, French, and to some extent French world of ballet, and which included both very conservative forms as well as more open forms. But even with Diaghilev, who certainly was a very sophisticated man, there seems to be no real connection between his world and this world of Ausdrucktanz. It just doesn't seem to be there. Moreover, the Ausdrucktanz dancers of the 1920s were very anti-ballet. And Ніжинська, having trained all her life in this vocabulary, felt that it was not a vocabulary to just get rid of and then invent. Why invent something new when, the way Duncan tried to do, or others, when you have inherited something that is very useful? And her argument was always, we have to add to it, we have to modernize it, we have to update it, but we don't have to throw it all out.
Знову ж таки, неможливо провести такі чіткі зв'язки, простежити. Невідомо, чи вона читала теоретичні роботи, тому що ми знаємо, що вона не читала німецькою, і вона більше варилася в такому соку російської імміграції, частково французької. Це був світ балету, де було місце і дуже класичним формам, і більш модерністським, але її підхід до простору, до роботи з ансамблем, до скульптурності є дещо подібним, але оскільки вона навчалася, сама пройшла школу класичного балету, її підхід був таким, що не потрібно повністю від нього відмовлятися, а радше треба його модернізувати, якось змінювати, осучаснювати, а не відкидати повністю геть, як це пропагували теоретики Ausdrucktanz, які взагалі були налаштовані проти балетної класичної школи як такої.
There were certainly certain dancers, such as Kurt Jooss in the Green Table, and Ніжинська certainly saw the Green Table, but that was a little bit later. That was 1932. Yes, and that was performed in Paris. It won prize in Paris in 19. But that's a little bit later, and she at that point was already more, how shall I put this? Had Ніжинська succeeded in setting up her studio in Vienna, as she intended at some point, her choreography might have developed in a different direction. But instead, her center is this basically Russian emigre world in France, which was in certain respects very conservative. It had many of the older ballerinas from the Ніжинська had settled there. There were many critics who were extremely conservative who had settled there. And there were all of these young dancers who were training, and they wanted to be ballet dancers. And training in ballet was an act of, you might say, cultural affirmation for them. So in this world, she in a sense has to become more balletic rather than sort of more contemporary. So it's interesting to imagine if she had settled in Vienna or in Germany, in Dresden, let's say, or in Berlin, would her ballet have looked the same way? And I suspect not. But that the circumstances, in a sense, I don't want to say forced her, but guided her into another direction.
Був ще гурт Йос, була постановка «Зелений стіл», яку вона бачила у 32-му році, був поставлений в Парижі, і ця вистава пройшла з успіхом, мала нагороди, але вона її побачила вже згодом, вже коли пройшла той свій власний шлях модернізації, так мовити. І якби їй таки вдалося у Відні знову відкрити школу руху, як вона то планувала, і то невідомо, яким шляхом би пішла розвиватися її манера, мабуть, що вона була б більше вірною тим ідеям, які вона мала в Києві, коли тут мала цю свою студію. Але склалися обставини, що вона варилася більше у середовищі російських емігрантів, середовище, яке було досить консервативним, і там їй не вдалося повністю піти тим шляхом, який вона в юності собі розвивала, і, мабуть, якби життя склалося інакше, то вона би більше пішла таким модерним шляхом.
Про студентів Ніжинської, які стали, потім перейшли до circulation. Ми знаємо, що Чистякова була. Хто саме і взагалі як?
Well, there's this Nadia Shuvarska, who choreographed a number of, some of the movement in Kurvas's dancers. There's someone else named Stelkova, Evgenia Stelkova, I think. I don't know how it's pronounced, but it's Strelkova. And there were a few others. I mean, I don't have a list of all the dancers. I have never found a program for any of her productions here in Kiev. None. So the people I know who she worked with, mainly I have the list from letters that are in her archives because she kept all the letters. And so there were many who ended up becoming visual artists, but Stelkova was one of them, or Stelkova was one of the ones who became a visual artist. But first she danced with, she acted with Kurvas. She first was Ніжинська, then she Kurvas, and then she became a visual artist. Yes, and there were a number of them who became visual artists. I don't know. So if anyone finds a program of anything that Ніжинська choreographed did in Kiev, truly the only program I have in her archive is of the little humpbacked horse. So if, please tell Larissa so that she can scan it and send it to me.
Спільне коло з Курбасом і учнів, учениць, то була Валентина Чистякова, і вона була ученицею Ніжинської і ставила хореографію в деяких виставах Курбаса.
Ні, Чистякова не ставила.
Shuvarska was the one who choreographed.
Not when Чистякова.
Чистякова, I don't think so. Maybe a little bit, but not much. She was maybe a performer.
It's very important about Chestakova because it's, you know, in Ukrainian, everybody who studies, who criticizes, or I don't know, Kurvas, they prove that Chestakova, she's the student of Bronislava Ніжинська, she's the wife of Les Kurvas. That's very important. So have you found any proof, like in the private archive of Bronislava Ніжинська, that Chestakova was 100% the student of Bronislava Ніжинська? That's the question. So which is here is quite important, you know.
I'm just trying to think through. There's something she told. There's something in Virlana's book with.
Yes. So this is the only. Моє запитання було про те, чи знаходила на якісь підтвердження інші, скажімо, в приватному архіві Броніслави Ніжинської, якоїсь підтвердження того, що Чистякова була її студенткою. Так? Тому що ми знаємо, що 100%, що у нас так все, що Чистякова просто Броніслава Ніжинської вчилася. I translate my question and that's just to make it more.
Yes.
Тому що там була і студія Броніслави Ніжинської, де вона була свої експерименти, і плюс ще додатково високій студії, де займалася просто, вона должна була займатися, і тут
Це ж на Крещатике было, да?
Скажімо, так.
Как рабочий период.
І тоді хто танцював, точно так же і за одною із учениць, які приходили до цієї
Лютеранський Крещатик ми тут робимо.
Чи можливо з учениць її приходили в цю центру студію, і він за одною із учениць потрапив вже саме до школи цієї. Тобто тут дослідники досліджують, як саме, а потім одна із учениць запросила його, і він теж попав далі.
Ми з Верляною Ткач сперечалися з приводу того, де географічно знаходилася студія Броніслави Ніжинської.
Фундуклеївська, 921.
Там же написано було.
Так, а тут було написано. Фундуклеївська. Фундуклеївська 21.
Yes.
So it's now it's Bogdan Khmelnytsky.
It's across the street from the other. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, there it is. Now, she was bombed at some point, and that was when she lost part of her hearing. So it's possible they moved somewhere else. But yes, I did visit that other studio the last time I was here off of Krishate. And I have no idea at what point that was part of her, at what point she was actually teaching there, whether it was simultaneous with the School of Movement, whether it was connected with another studio, because I know that even during the period of the School of Movement, she was also sometimes teaching at with the Kultur League. She was working with opera singers, and occasionally she was also dealing with the opera theater. So there were many times where she was teaching at different places. She also seems to have had a studio even before the School of Movement. So I'm not sure where that was. Also, she was teaching at Centro Studio, which was the Tereshenko thing, which was the big proletarian theater. So there was a lot there, but she still had her own students whom she taught separately. That's what Serge Lifar talks about in his first memoir, which he published in French around 1934. But I'm not sure what the relationship is between that other studio and the School of Movement, that's here. I think there was
студія, яка, власне, школа руху на Фундуклеївській 21, туди потрапила бомба, і навіть Ніжинська втратила частково слух під час того бомбардування. але вона одночасно або раніше, або паралельно з тим, відомо, викладала ще у декількох студіях по місту. Це могло бути там на Хрещатику, з лютеранською, де були. І вона також викладала для оперних співаків, викладала рух. І також у культурлігі теж вона працювала. І в то, що заснував Терещенко з пролетарський центростудію, також і там. І остаточно невідомо, в яких були стосунки між тобою ці студії, і коли хронологічно вони працювали.
Ну, це все було одночасно і учениці навіть, її приходили, вони допомагали в цих студіях. І за одною тих учениць Лефар вже попав далі до цієї школи саме. Ну, це те, що я прочитала.
Well, actually, Serge Lifar went to the School of Movement and she didn't want him. I don't know why. I have suspicions, but I don't feel ready to talk about them. But and so therefore someone said, well, if you want to take classes, go and with her, go to the Centro Studio, because it's a proletarian studio, so she has to take everyone and teach everyone. So, you know, I don't know. He did not study on a regular basis with her. In fact, when he only went to the Ballet Russe. He was not invited by her. Diaghilev always had a shortage of men. You know, ballet always needs men. Diaghilev had a shortage of men. And Ніжинська said, I have men in my studio, so he said, fine, we'll bring them. So she invites several of her men who had studied with her, Lapitsky, Unger, a couple of others, the Hoyer brothers, and and one other. But he, I don't know, had disappeared or something. And not literally, he was no longer dancing. And Unger says, because I have the letters, writes to her and says, you know, there's that Serge, you know, Lifar, he's been working very, very hard, and I think he should come. So therefore, that's when he came. He was not one of the regular students, you know, at all. Yes, he tells many, many, many stories.
Колись прийшов до її студії, до школи руху, але вона чомусь не захотіла працювати, не захотіла, щоб він був її учнем. Я маю певні здогадки, але чому це сталося, але я не готова про них говорити, було багато історій довкола того. І може вона йому сказала, що ось є центростудія, можна туди звернутися, тому що вони повинні приймати всіх, хто не звертаються на іншій основі. І щодо Дягілєва і Балєвюсь, йому завжди бракувало працівників чоловіків, і він звернувся до Ніжинської, щоб вона порадила когось зі своєї студії, і вона привела туди до Дягілєва Лапіцького, Унгера, братів Хоєр, і ще одного, але Ліфаря серед рекомендованих нею не було. Потім вже Унгер писав, що Ліфар так наполегливо працює, можна було б його запросити, і таким чином він туди теж потрапив. Але багато тут було таких історій особистісних, про які ще будемо говорити, мабуть, колись.
Там с Лифарем получилось просто. Она не захотела брать его в студию. И он как комсостав, он служил в Красной армии командиром. Он обратился, и тогда ему сказали идти в центростудию, где она обязана была преподавать историю. Он был, когда, вот прочитайте мемуары того же Лифаря.
В мене є питання. Наприклад, я зрозуміла, що це було зовсім не так. Хто йому не відмовляв саме в центрі студії.
А в центре студии не могли отказать, потому что... Да. А в центре студии находилась на лютеранской, с левой стороны дом не сохранился, угол лютеранской и Крещатика, вот сейчас арка там, а там дальше был дом...
Це до центру студії, а далі за одною із учениць, тому що ці учениці, які приходили за Ніжинською, їм сподобалось. Хоча про це ми далі, ми можемо не казати, що це саме так. І ця учениця його привела саме до цієї школи. Він там не займався, він розповів свої мемуари, що він їх бачив, йому це сподобалося. Саме там в нього розвилася любов к хореографії, до танцю. Йому сподобались балерини представлені в Ніжинської школі руху. І далі оця учениця йому написала, що ось так і так збирають так школу, ти сам туди їхав. А вже там, коли він приїхав, то йому, оце Бронислав Ніжинська каже, він був моїм учнем. А він просто за одною із таких студентів туди потрапив. А далі там... Не знаю, я пришла на художественный литературный художественный сценарий. Вот очень симпатичный молодой человек.
I have another question about the Ніжинськa's school. You mentioned in another lecture that her School of Movement opened in the winter of 1918, so right?
No, 1919.
1919, okay, so it's still like during the revolutionary period in Kyiv. And in February 1920, it actually received, resources from the then Bolshevik government?
I think it was the Bolshevik government because she was there when, she never left Kyiv until she emigrated. She was always here, unlike Exter, for instance, who went to Odessa and then to Moscow. So she was here through all the different changes of government.
Right, so my question is about, so she's received this funding in 1920, a year later in spring 1921, they closed her school and...
So it appears, I mean, I
Right,
was
so may
very
I
shocked.
translate and then...
Yes.
Yeah. Коротше, питання моє про школу руху Ніжинську, яка відкрилася в 19-му році в Києві, якраз під час революції.
По-моему, в 18-м, в конце 18-го.
Вона каже 19-го.
Да, ну может, потому что при Скоропадском еще.
Ну вот, 10 января.
Так, і в 20-му році, вона отримує офіційний ресурс, підтримку від того уряду, який був тут зараз, який, я думаю, що більшовицький, тим радянським. Більшовицький, скажімо. І в 21-му році ці самі люди, чи ці люди, які... Коротше, вони вже закрили її школу, і вона лишає Київ. Тож моє питання просто про цей час, що змінилося, як вона на це дивилася. So I'm wondering what changed in this period of time, and if you've learned in reading her memoirs, kind of what her thoughts were on the situation.
Когда вот в 20-м
in her diaries, I have some diary material that begins in December 1919 and goes, this one diary, through 1922. So this, unfortunately, does not cover the earlier period, but it does, at some point, she finally says, the school is no more.
And there's no reason,
There is no reason. Her students came, I assume at this point they're the more advanced students. They came, they didn't know what to do. Then they begin to think of going off and doing other things. But why, I can't explain. There is no explanation. It is not impossible that her school was suddenly was considered too elite because she insisted it was not a proletarian studio. It was a studio that valued growing mastery, corporeal mastery and growing sophistication in choreography. In her diary also, she has a couple of references to Margot Tereshchenko. She doesn't seem to like him. There also are allusions, nothing specific, about being followed. In another, not in the diary, but in something else, she writes about her house being searched, and they look in her baby's crib for, it's they, nothing, it's just they, looking in the crib to see if there's anything hidden there. She talks, again, not in the diary, but in some notes she wrote later, about going with one of her students to the prison to see, because someone was imprisoned, or the father or brother of one of her students, or one of her dancers was imprisoned. So it's clear that there are these other forces at work, and and it's possible that had something to do with the closing of the studio at that moment. Later, she thought that she had given her studio over to her 3 best students to run, but then her opera friend, Nina Moiseyevna, wrote to her at one point and said, "There is no school anymore. Forget your students. This one is doing that. This one is doing that. This one gives a few classes now and then." So there's clearly this scattering that's going on. And it's in that scattering period that Shuvarska finds her way to Kurvas, that Spilkova finds her way to Kurvas, etc., after this scattering period. So I haven't answered your question. I'm sorry.
Those diaries are published? Published, or only?
Actually, this one diary has been published in Moscow in a publication of the Academy of Arts.
Mm-hmm.
They did something, and one of the editors, Elizabeth Suritz, is an old friend of mine, and so I literally photographed all those things and sent them to her.
Дуже маленький тираж.
Yeah, I didn't never heard.
Oh, small print.
You translate?
Yes, that's it.
Отже, я почала щоденникові матеріали. Був один щоденник, який починається від грудня 19-го року, і вона його вела аж до 22-го року. На жаль, раніших матеріалів немає. І в якийсь момент вона там пише, що школи вже нема. І точно не пояснює причини, але ми можемо робити певні припущення, тому що, можливо, цю школу закрили, оскільки вона ідеологічно не вписувалася в пролетарський підхід мистецтва для пролетаріату. І, можливо, це якось пов'язано з ідеєю, з фігурою Марка Терещенка, яку вона не дуже любила, може він теж якось мав вплив на те. Є певні алюзії, певні натяки на якісь події, такі погрозливі в її щоденниках. Вона пише вони проводили обшук у неї в помешканні і попросалися у люльці для маляти, там щось шукали. І також вона їздила до в'язниці з однією зі своїх учениць, тому що в в'язницю посадили чи то її брата, чи то батька, така була атмосфера. Але чітко вона не пише, які були причини, чому закрили студію. І в якийсь момент її учні, може, старшого курсу прийшли, побачили, що двері закриті, не знали, куди йти, що робити далі. І потім Ніна Моїсеївна, одна з близьких подруг, Бронислав Ніжинської писала їй, вже коли та була в еміграції, що, мовляв, ти сподівалася, що передала свою справу 3 своїм ученицям найкращим, але цього не відбулося, тому що кожна з цих 3 займається вже чимось іншим, тобто відбулося таке розпорошення всього цього кола, цього руху. І Шуварська, і Стрілкова пішли до театру Курбаса, а інші вже подалися хто куди. І ще було питання, чи видали друком ці щоденники. Так, вони вийшли друком в Москві, в Академії мистецтв, так, невеличким тиражем.
About when she was receiving resources for the school. So do you know who she was receiving the resources from?
No, but I do know that there was someone she speaks about as having been on certain committees with, etc., named Levitsky, who is a poet, and he also had a bureaucratic, he was part of the administration. He had a girlfriend who was one of the dancers. Right.
But it's known when exactly which day where Germans came to Kiev or Polish army came to Kiev, occupied Kiev, seized Kiev, or Bolsheviks. It's known, so it's very important to know when the students got, state, whatever, state support. So
February
then it's
1920.
It was in 1920 she had, but I don't know when exactly she received it. Also, sometime, the support, I believe, was in 3 forms. One, at some point she alludes to the fact that they had greater food supplements, that they were rations, that they got more food than other people because, as she explained to someone, artists were treated fairly well.
Bolsheviks.
What?
Bolsheviks, probably.
Then she also said firewood, that there was firewood that came. It was very cold. Those winters were very cold, as you know. And then the other thing, I believe, is access to certain kinds of venues for performance. And that would have been another sign of being accepted. But one can go through the memoirs and see that, through the diary, and to see that there are certain moments, like she performed something before something or other in, I don't know, maybe January or February 1920, and therefore she received some kind of, that she was approved, and therefore...
You mean she was performing for some kind of official festivities, or...?
No, for an official committee. So that they could see what she was doing, what she was up to.
So her art was approved by...
Whoever, but it doesn't necessarily say who it's by, who is doing the approving, and what it is that they really get out of it.
One of the reasons could be with the Bolsheviks, it was Bolsheviks' time when she left. So one of the reasons for her leaving was her origins, Polish origins. She would be very suspected person, because Poles, they were together with Ukraine against Soviet or Bolshevik Russia. That could be really.
She seems to have tried to just stay very focused on the school, and that she, but she did participate in certain things, and she had certain performances that seemed to be for soldiers or some whatever, and which seemed to have a political connection. Whether she was doing it just to be fed, to feed herself and her 2 children and her mother, whether she was doing it because of ideological belief, I don't know. I do think part of her was very excited by that moment of excitement. And that moment of excitement that seemed to give permission to do everything, that seemed to accept the modern, was something that she long remembered. there's a letter from Meller to her after she probably from about, they never dated their letters, but from like maybe 1922 or 1923, and he's saying, we remember those times, he and his wife, we remember those times when we had nothing, but we had art, and art was very pure. And I know it can sound very crazy and naive, but I think she did believe that, and I think others believed it as well. And certainly when she got back to Diaghilev, when she got back to the West, and she gets to Vienna, she has to go to work in a music hall. This is a woman who never, ever, ever wanted to work at anything like the Moulin Rouge in Vienna. I mean, she never worked there. And she never talked about it. I documented it by going to a Viennese newspaper and saw that for 2.5 months, until she rejoined Diaghilev, she was dancing every night at this place. The diaries are, she's looking around, she's disgusted by Vienna.